Hello everyone, Solmon here, and I dare anyone to find a topic as polarizing as the E2s. On one side of the fence you have the E2 haters, who could honestly pass as a fascist organization with the way they so vividly describe their hatred for a locomotive class that doesn't actually exist anymore. And on the other side you have completely brainwashed idiots who defend the E2s as if they were a problematic teenage pop star from the early 2000s. Now, this video has spawned from a recent debate that emerged on Twitter about the true truth about the E2s, and while I could rag on for minutes destroying both sides with epic facts and logic, I feel it would be better for the sake of historical analysis and documentation to actually make a somewhat proper video essay on the topic. So, without further ado, let's dive in. In the early 1910s, Britain was at its economical peak. With trade coming in from around the world and its navy expanding, the British Empire was a maritime power, and so its docks and harbours and ports were the literal essence of its existence. Also vital to its existence was the carrying of said goods, because having endless amounts of material is great, as long as you can distribute them to buyers and get them to factories to turn them into more refined objects. Thus, as one can imagine, the marshalling of such gargantuan amount of goods coming in from the sea needs a powerful engine, and the LBSCR, the railway in charge of Britain's most important and flourishing ports, up until now had used a variety of engines to do this job. The E1 tank engines, the literal backbone of the railway, were either not strong enough or completely worn out in the case of the older units. By the 1910s, they had given remarkable service, but it was time for an update. Douglas March, chief superintendent at the time, had intended to rebuild the class into E1Xs, the X standing in for improvements made in the design to bring them up to par with current needs. However, only one of them was ever rebuilt, as in July of 1911, he retired due to his rapidly declining health, much the pleasure of everyone at Brighton Works. Indeed, due to office politics, he never was popular with high management, or anyone for that matter. Thus, enter stage left, Lawson Boskowski Billington. Born on February 4th, 1882, being the last of three sons born to a British father and Polish mother, explaining the name, he was a bright spark, and by the turn of the century he would study the arts of motive power under his father, whom, at the time, was locomotive superintendent at the LBSCR, the same position his son would take up some 10 years later. By late 1912, Lawson had overseen the construction of three classes of his predecessor's locomotives. He had learned quite a bit, and thus he would make his first proper locomotive class to fill the vacuum left by, at this point, struggling E1s. Thus, the E2 design was born. At 52 tons and with a tractive effort of 21,000 pounds, these engines were remarkable in pretty much all aspects, except for one crucial detail: the range. These engines wouldn't really be able to go very far. With only 3 tons of coal in their bunkers and 5,000 gallons of water in their tanks, the idea of long-distance journeys was very much out of the window. However, the logic behind this quote-unquote flaw is that the E2s were meant as heavy shunters and short-distance freight engines. So, in following with their mission profile, any added fuel capacity would inherently be dead weight. The class entered service with the first locomotive of the series, number 100, arriving in June of 1913, with the last joining the fleet in October 1916, with a total build run of little over 3 years and 10 units. In their designed role as heavy shunters and short freighters, they did their work quietly with no remarkable achievements. However, in 1914, the year when everything seems to happen, they were tried on push-pull passenger trains, and to put their performance into modern language, it was a rather cringe. Nonetheless, it does seem to be the first thing anyone points to when they try to claim the E2s were bad engines. However, like a famous scientist once said, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will go its entire life thinking it's stupid. And this is where my issue with most of the discussion about the E2 stems from. Why is everyone judging their worth from the one thing they weren't meant or designed to do? Even people whom I absolutely adore and look up to in the community or in the larger railway circle have made this error when talking about them. And personally, I see it as inherently intellectually dishonest, because if you're going to have a discussion about the E2s, keeping in mind what they're designed for is incredibly important. However, one has to keep in mind that the E2s were far and very, very far from flawless. With the first 5 engines of the class, Lawson had drastically underestimated their thirst for water, leading to the last 5 of the class to be built with extended water tanks to remedy this issue. Another problem was their stability. As freight-focused engines, you would be forgiven for thinking comfort when underway wouldn't be that much of a concern, but according to crews, if you took them to any speed near 50 miles an hour, they would actually start doing a very incredible and convincing impression of maracas. Not to mention the fact the boilers that came from the questionable E2 tanks were so incredibly bad at keeping the pressure the firemen built up so carefully that they would completely drop over a few miles for seemingly no reason. But despite these issues that would have gotten any other class scrapped, rebuilt, or just thrown to the wayside, the E2s managed to live a surprisingly long life, and it's thanks to 3 major factors. Number 1. The world was at war not even a year after they entered service, so replacing them wouldn't be too kind to the LBSCR's pockets. Number 2. The Southern Railway, after the First World War, wasn't that interested in super-modern shunters, as electrification of the main line was their main priority, so the E2s were good enough. Then, the third point being that British Railways, after the Second World War, found themselves in such a desperate and cash-strapped situation that literally any engine they could get their hands on was good enough, again, including a subpar shunter from 30 years ago. This all meant that the E2s managed to live well into the 50s and 60s, not because they were some sort of revolutionary locomotive, but simply for the fact that they were, like I said before, good enough, and that their owners had no real other choice. When talking about the E2s, a lot of people tend to try and compare them to the Austerities and USA dock tanks, whom they served alongside in Southampton docks. And while it may seem like a fair comparison, one has to remember the first E2 entered service in 1913. The first Austerities and Yank tanks entered service in 1943 and 1942 respectively. Not only is there a 20-year gap between the two, but the 2 latter classes were built during the Second World War and were designed to be go everywhere, do everything sort of engines, compared to the E2s who were built significantly earlier in the century and had a much more niche job. However, if I could go back in time and redesign the E2s, this is what I would make. A tank engine version of Billington's K-Class. These were superb mixed traffic engines with some of the best pre-grouping performance, and with a few tweaks, in my opinion, you could honestly feel the niche the E2s were trying to plug. With a similar wheelbase, a much greater tractive effort, and added stability, these could have been the solution to much of the issues the E2s faced. Not to mention the engines similar to this design did in fact exist on the LBSCR at the time. And, of course, I'm not a railway engineer, and I'm sure that most everyone watching this video could probably come up with a better design than I have. But inherently, this is just to show that Billington could have and has done better when it comes to engine design. And that does leave the question open to, what would history look like if the E2s were successful? Or what would they actually look like as a successful design? Of course, you can't talk about the E2s without talking about Thomas. And to be honest, I don't see it as a bad thing. I think it's great Thomas uses real classes of locomotive, and it gets people interested in history. It keeps the engines we still have around, and has the potential to bring back old ones. Although, I do feel some people have let their attachment to a fictional train override their common sense when it comes to understanding the E2s. However, coming up to said people and beating them with a stick just for not being correct isn't the right way to deal with widespread misinformation about any sort of historical topic. That sort of behavior is never the solution. In the ideal world, people would say something wrong, and others would either give them the right information or point them towards credible sources. So, in conclusion, what were the E2s? They were a mediocre class of tank engine that were designed by someone who was first dabbling in the arts of locomotive construction. Indeed, a rather sober conclusion. Too often these days, people expect everything to be groundbreaking and revolutionary, otherwise what's the point of keeping it in the history books? But you'll find that it is the fate of most machines, and indeed, most locomotives. They just do their work quietly and fade into obscurity. But for a class of less than average tank engines, what their final legacy ended up being is quite remarkable. Don't you agree?